Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring to you guys a tutorial on how to build a Tic Tac Toe using ReactJS. So this I would definitely consider a beginner to intermediate project because it will teach you a lot of the fundamentals and how to implement like UI features, logic, maybe a bit of algorithm as well, and it is definitely something that will help your skills in React. It definitely teaches you a lot about hooks, especially the UseEffectHook and the UseEffectHook. So I think it is a really nice project if you're learning React. And even if you know React, I definitely think it is a great project because I think of myself as a good React developer. However, just making this helped me understand a lot of stuff that I was still a bit confused on. So it's definitely a great learning process, right? So basically, as you can see over here, this is what we're going to be building. It is just a simple board, and if you click on it, you can play a tic-tac-toe game. So I'm going to win this game with the X, and you can see that when I win, an alert is popped and it says game finished, winning player is the X. So I can play again. Let me just win diagonally right now so you guys can see it. When I win this, it will say game finished, winning player X again. I can win with the O as well. Let me just try this, as you can see, and it will say game finished, winning player O. So this is what we're going to be building, and yeah, let's get into the implementation. So as you guys saw, that's actually the project we're going to be building, and now let's actually get into the implementation on how to build this. So you can see right here, I have like a completely new React application. Actually, it's not even a React application yet. It's just a folder, a folder that I opened in my VS Code, and I opened up here the terminal where I'm going to run the create React app command to actually start our application. So I'm using Yarn, so I'm going to run yarn create React app and then a dot, and it's going to create our application here with all the packages. So if you're using npm, just like put the command npx create React app, and it should do the same thing. I'll just come back in a second where it finished installing. Okay guys, so as you can see, our things finished installing, and let's actually run our application yarn start, and it should open up over here our local host, which, as you can see, it's going to open up with the normal like boilerplate for a create React app application. So while it's opening, let's actually start by erasing all the unnecessary files that already come with a React application. For example, I don't want to do any tests. I also don't want the index.css, neither the logo or the setup tests. So I always delete those. So let's move them to trash. And let me also remove the index.css from the import over here. And you don't need to do this. This is just something that I do because I don't want my folder to be, my project to be full of like unnecessary files, right? So this is basically the start of our application over here. And as you can see in our local host, if I refresh this, it's going to be an empty, just a blank website, right? So let's actually start by just simply out building our logic, right? So how exactly are we going to build that? Well, think about this. A board for a tic-tac-toe exists. It has 9 different squares, right? So 9 different plays that you can make. So what I would like to do in this kind of situations is either create a state that is going to have a 2D array or a state that has a 1D array. But that state will basically be a variable that is going to hold our list containing all the different options that we can choose. So I'm going to import useState over here, useState from React, because we're going to be using it in our application. And the first state we're going to create is just a simple state called the board. Let's call it board, and let's use a function called setBoard like this, and it's going to be equal to just a very simple array, which it's going to start with all empty values. And what do I mean by that? Each of these elements over here in the array can have 3 different values as strings, right? It can either be an X for the player that is an X, it can be an O, which is the other player, and it can be empty like this. When we start the game, it's every square will have an empty box, right? And when you click on it, it should change to whichever player is playing right now. So let's initialize this array with actually 9 of this empty strings, and let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, because there's actually 9 squares in a board of a Tic Tac Toe game, right? So this is kind of like where we're going to write all of our logic, right? We're going to be manipulating this state so that it will demonstrate, it will update our UI to show the new values. So before we actually work with this state, let's start by creating our board, right? Because currently it's just a simple and empty website. So let's come over here and create a div, which will have a class name of board, like this. And inside of here, we're going to do something interesting, because think about this. We're going to have a square, and I'm going to actually just start writing the CSS as well so you guys can clearly see it. I'm going to erase everything that already comes with the CSS, and I'm just going to leave the app the app, right? And inside of here, I'm actually going to be making some changes to the app div. The first change that I want to make is just like turning the width to be equal to 100 VW, which if you don't know what it means, it's just saying that we want the width of the app div to be 100 of the string, like the whole screen, and then 100 VH for the height. And then I want to change this to display flex so we can have everything right at the middle, right? So it can just come over here and say justify content center, and then align item center, and then we'll have our board right at the middle of the screen. And then what I also like to do is I also like to just have every React application remove the padding and the margin from the body, because it already comes with a bit of margin and padding, so we need to remove that. And then we need to basically put some styles to the board, right? So the board will be a 500 by 500 square at the center, so 500 pixels. Then the height might be something like 500 pixels as well. Then we can add a background color. The one that I used is actually aquamarine, this one right here that already comes with normal CSS. And then we can also add a border. So I'm going to add a border over here of 1 pixel. It's going to be solid and black, like this. And then what we can do is we can also use a display flex and also just change the flex direction to column. What are we doing here is basically, if we come back here to our screen, you'll see that, and I'll save this, you'll see that now we have just a square at the center of our application. And by the way, what I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to push this to the side a bit and then push this here so you guys can see the code and the application at the same time. I'm just going to put it like this. And what we're doing here is the board is actually the square, right? And the app is just the whole screen with the square in its center. And inside of here, we're going to actually divide this board into 3 rows, because that's how a normal tic-tac-toe thing, like a game, works, right? There's going to be 3 rows, and each row will contain 3 columns. So that makes 9 squares. So what we can do is we can actually, inside of this board, create 3 divs, which is going to have a class name of row, right? And I'm just going to copy this 3 times, like this, and we're going to have 3 rows. And now we can come here to our CSS, and we can actually just style the row as well. The styling for the row will be very simple. We'll just come over here and say row, and inside of it, we're going to give it a flex, because remember, our board has a display of flex, so we can just make this equal to 33%, and it knows that the height for each of the rows will be 33% of the height of the board. So we're gonna evenly divide our rows into, like, our board into 3 rows. And then we're gonna come over here and just also give a display flex for the row, and a flex direction of row inside of our row. And this will basically allow us to make all of our squares inside of each row to be side by side. So let's for now just add a border to it. We're not going to actually have a border, but I just want you guys to see that we're actually correctly dividing it into 3 different rows, as you can see. And now we can actually just remove this, because we're not going to have a border for our rows. So now that we have this done, we need to start working on actually making our squares, right? So we need to have a component which is going to represent each of these squares over here. So I'm going to push this to the side a bit so you guys can see it better, because we're going to be writing a lot more code right now. And we're actually going to come here to our src and just create a new folder called components. So I'm not going to divide this project into many components. You could definitely make this look better in your code wise if you divide it into many components, but I'm just actually going to create one component, which is going to be called square. And the reason for this is because I don't want to overcomplicate the project, and I just think that this will be it's the only component that is really necessary. So we have here a component called square, and this component over here will represent each of the squares that we can choose in a tic-tac-toe game, right? So what exactly do we do here? Well, let's think about it. A square will need two pieces of information. The first piece of information that it needs is the actual value. And what do I mean by the value is either an empty string like this, either an X or an O, right? Because inside of this box, that will put the value over here to be displayed. So if it's an X, there will be an X in the square. If it's an O, there's going to be an O, right? And the other piece of information that we need is actually a function that is going to be called whenever we click on this square. So let's call this function make. Maybe actually I'll just call it choose square, something like this. And it's going to be a function that we're going to actually create in the parent of this component, and it's going to work like this. In our div, when we click on this, we just want to call the choose square like this. And this is basically how our component is going to work. We're just going to have it like this, and it's going to be a div. We also can give it a class name. So I'm going to give it a class name over here. Its class name will be square like this. And to do that, we actually need to import our CSS file inside of this folder, inside of this file, sorry. So let's go back twice and say app.css. And now we're going to have the square having being able to access our CSS that we're going to create for it, right? So now that we created this component, we can actually import this component here at the top. So let's import square from /component/square. And we can now think about this. Our square, each row has 3 squares, right? So we can just come over here, and for now, let's just create our first square, our first row, right? Just put squares for the first row. And this is how we're actually going to do it. We're going to create the component over here and just paste it 3 times. And now we need to pass a value for the square. And we also need to pass a choose square function, right? So for the choose square function right now, let's just put an empty function over here, which will just alert the square that we're going to choose, right? For example, this is going to be square number 0. And why it's going to be square number 0? Because this is how indexes work. Think about it. The first square is going to be 0. The second one is going to be 1. The third one is going to be 2. So it's always 1 less than the actual element in the array, right? And this is how it's going to work. This is the first row. This is the second row. And this is the third row, right? So this 3 squares over here, the value for this will initially be just an empty string, like we mentioned. Or we can actually just put it like this. It's going to be board at 0, right? So because this is the first element. And now we can copy this and paste it on each of these squares. And actually just change it, because the first square is 0, but the second one is 1. So we want to alert 1. And the third one is 2, and we want to alert 2. So now what happens is, let's try this. Oh, we actually need to style our square, right? So let's come here to our app.css, and let's create something over here called, let me see, dot square. And we're not going to do a lot of CSS for this. We're actually halfway done with our CSS. The only thing we need left is actually to create the square. So the square is going to be very similar to the row, in the sense that it's going to have 33% of its parent component, right, or its parent div. So it's going to be 33% because there's going to be 3 squares, and they need to evenly fill up the row. And then over here, we can set the height to be 100% of the row, so 100%. And let's just push this down. And let's actually add a border for each of the squares so we can differentiate them. So border of 1 pixel, solid and black. I think that looks nice. And then what I like to do is I also like to give it a cursor of pointer. So it changes the cursor when you hover it. And let's make it a display grid so that we can place stuff right at the center, right? And then we can just use place items center like this. And finally, let's just increase the font size inside of it so that like the value, which is either X or O, is pretty large. Let's make it 30 pixels, and let's make the color black so that we can clearly see it. And I like to change the font family, but this is totally unnecessary. I like to make it actually Arial, which already comes with normal CSS, as you can see. And now you can see that we have three beautiful squares here, which don't actually have any X's or O's, because remember, it starts as an empty string, right? If we wanted to display an X, I could just come over here and say that the value is equal to X, right? And then the first one would have an X, as you can see right here. But we actually want to make it so that it will dynamically change as we update our board. And when I click on one of them, let me just refresh this. Let me actually save this. When we click on one of them, it's going to display which one it is. So this is actually element 0 in the board. This is element 1, and this is element 2, right? So we can see that our functions and our components are working, which is great. But what do we do now? How do we actually move forward from this? Let's think about this. We have our component over here, our square, and we just want to be able to see its values and change its values as we click on them, right? So what we can do is we can actually create a function inside of our app.js here, which is going to allow us to choose which square we want to update in our board, right? So let's create this function over here. Let's call it choose square, as we did before, and it's going to be a function which is going to be called whenever we click on one of these squares. So actually, instead of passing this empty function over here, we can just pass choose square like this. Over here, I'm going to update this too, like this, and this right here. However, we need to pass an argument to this function. It's not going to be just it's not going to not have an argument. The argument that we want to pass is the actual square that we're clicking. So for example, this is going to be, when we click on this, we want to update the element, the square 0. So we need to pass the actual value over here, which we can actually call it the index, right? So the actual index that we want to change, or the square, right? So I'm going to call this square, and for each function call, we can just call the square that we want to update, right? So to do that, we can just do it like this. We create an anonymous function and say choose square and pass the actual square that we want to update. So choose square, and this is going to be 0, and this one is going to be 1, and this is going to be 2. So let me do 1, 2, like this. And now what we're doing is we're going to call this function and update and pass as an argument the square that we're calling, right, that we're clicking. So what do we do inside of this choose square? Well, this is probably going to be one of the hardest logic. Probably actually the hardest logic that we're going to write in this program is going to be checking if like the board has a winner, right? But for now, this is the hardest thing we're going to do so far. And what we're going to write inside of here is basically we want to update our board so that it will change the value for the square, so the square we have over here, so the value to whichever player is currently playing, right? Because like we have two different players, and it needs to know which player is playing and update the value over here. So how do we determine that? So the first thing we have to do here is actually create a state called player, which is going to be constantly changing, right? So player and set player, like this. And it's going to be equal to a use state, which will initially start as an X. So usually the player that starts first is an X. I don't know why, but usually it is, I think. And we're just going to set it as the initial player, the first person to choose which square they want, correct? So what we do is, instead of this choose square, we can very easily just come inside of here, and we can set our board to be updated. And inside of here, we can actually pass a map function. So we can map through our board, and for every iteration, for every element in the board, we want to get two specific things. The first thing we want to grab is what's the current value in that board, in that element, right? Or in that square. And the second thing is the actual index. And the reason for this is because we're going to run a function for each element, and we're going to choose to update it if the current index is equal to the square. So it's going to run a loop through this whole board. And if it finds, for example, if we pass for the square that we want to update the square at index 1, then it's going to reach for the index 1 over here. and it's going to say, okay, so square is equal to index, right? So what I want to do is I want to change that value from empty to the current player, right? So inside of here, we can ask if index is equal to square, then we want to return the player. And if you don't understand how map works, I actually have a video. I can link it up here at a box at the top of the video. If you want to check it out, I will go a lot more in depth on how map works. It is a very extremely important function in JavaScript. So if you want to check that out, just click the link above. So now that we know this, we're just going to return the player. We're going to change it so that it's going to be equal to the player if the index is equal to the square. So only one element will be changed to the current player, the only element that has the index equal to the square. And if this isn't true, so every other element we want to return its current value. So just not change anything, right? But there's also another thing that we need to take into account, which is we just want to update the values if their current value, like this, if value is equal to empty. And the reason for this is because imagine I click on this. It's not going to work for now, but imagine I click on this button over here. Actually, it should be working. Let's test this. If I click on this, yeah, it's working. You can see I have an X, right? And we currently didn't write the logic for changing the player from X to O. However, think about this. If we don't put this val equal to an empty string over here, we're going to be allowed to change squares that already have been filled. So we only want to allow to change a square if its current value is empty. So if there isn't any X's or O's, we want to allow it to change. If there is, then we don't want it to change, right? So now let's actually write the logic to change the player who is playing right now. So what we want to do is basically after we choose the square, we just want to basically just ask a question if player is equal to an X, then we want to set player equals to an O, right? And if if it isn't equal to an X, then we just want to set player equal to an X, right? This is the basic logic. If it's currently an X, we want to change it to an O. If it wasn't an X, if it was an O, then we want to change it to an X. So what happens is we can now see it that if we click on this, it's an X. If we click on this, it's now an O. And if we click on this, it currently works. And if I'm currently an X, no, I'm actually currently an O, so I can't actually change squares that already have been filled because we put this piece of logic over here, right? So it's currently working, and let's actually just fill the rest of the squares. So I'm just going to copy all of this and paste it onto the other rows like this and like over here. And now all we wanted to do is just change the values, right? Because this is the second row, and the second row contains the indexes 3, 4, and 5, right? So let's change this to 3, and this to 3, and then this to 4, 4, then 5, and 5. And now we finished the second row, and now let's go to the third row, which has the indexes 6, 7, and 8, because there's 9 elements, right? So we can just come over here and say 6 and 6, then 7 and 7, and then our 8, which is the final element over here, and the 8 over here, right? So now let's save this, and you can see we have all of our squares, and we can choose each one we want beautifully. But obviously we didn't write any code to determine the winner, which is actually the hardest part in this program, right? Also, just before we get into any other logic, I like to get some visual representation when we click on stuff. So maybe what we can do is we can come over here to our CSS, and I'll just say it that when we click on the square, so when square is active, then I want to change the background color to something very light. So I actually have the color memorized here, and I'll just put it on. It's actually 6-4, then F4, then C4. This is the color. It's actually a slightly darker version of the color we have now. And when I click on this, you can see it kind of changes the color, right? You can see we have a visual representation when we click on the squares. So that's nice. And now let's actually focus on writing our logic, and we're done with all the CSS. So what do we need to do now? Well, let's think about it. When we refresh our page, we want to determine if the player has a winning condition, right? For example, this player over here just won because it has either a vertical, like 3 vertical of the O in this like together, as you can see right here, are either horizontal or diagonal, right? So we need to take into account all the different patterns that can exist. And I actually have those patterns because I made those patterns before just for the video, and I'll just explain to you guys what the patterns mean. So let's actually create a file over here called patterns, which is going to contain we're just gonna export over here all the different patterns that can exist in a game of Tic Tac Toe, right? So let's create this function called patterns, like this, patterns, and it's gonna be equal to an array of arrays. And what do I mean by patterns? I'm just gonna paste all the patterns that we can have in a Tic Tac Toe, and I'm gonna explain it to you guys. Okay, guys, so I'm back, and these are all the patterns that might occur and might lead for someone winning the game, and I'm going to explain to you guys what it means. So you can see we have, first of all, the pattern 0, 1, 2. So what does that mean? Well, just think about it. If there are 3 of the same, like for example, if the 0, 1, 2 squares are filled and they are all from the same player, then that player won, right? And the same goes for 3, 4, 5, which is 3, 4, 5. If it is filled, then it wins, and the same goes for the bottom row as well. So this is the kind of like, I'm just saying all the possibilities that can exist. So I went through every single row, which is this 3 over here, and then I went for every single column, which is this 3 over here. So 0, 3, and 6, then 1, 4, and 7, then 2, 5, and 8, right? And then I went for the diagonal ones. For example, you can win by filling up the 0, 4, and 8, and the 2, 4, and 6. The order doesn't matter at all because we're just gonna check if they have the same player on each of those rows, right? And why does this help us, right? Because we can come here to our app.js and we can just import this to our code. So I'm just gonna open this up. We can actually import the patterns array over here at the top. So I'm just gonna come over here and say import patterns from the file that we just created, /patterns over here. And now we have access to this array. But what happens is, whenever we choose, whenever we make a move, right? This is kind of a brute force way of checking every time if there's a winner. But it doesn't really matter because it is an algorithm that won't make that much difference because we just have a 3x3 board, right? So what happens is, for every move you make, we want to call a function that is going to check to see if one of those patterns has been fulfilled, right? So it's going to run through the whole board and check to see if one of those patterns are filled, right? So how do we do that? Let's actually create this function right now. It's going to be called something like check win, something like that. So I'm just going to call it check win. It's going to be a simple function, no arguments, which is going to be called every time you make a move. So every time you choose something, it's going to be called. And inside of it, the logic goes as following. We have the patterns array, right? So what we do is we need to first loop through this array. So patterns.forEach, we're going to loop it like this. And for every iteration, we grab the current pattern, right? We're just going to grab the pattern. So for each pattern that exists in the patterns array, we want to then just first of all loop at it again, loop through the pattern, and check to see if those indexes, because this the patterns array contains the indexes, right? The indexes in the array that in the board that makes a winning move. So we need to loop through them and just check to see if they're filled by the same person. So how do we check to see if they're filled by the same person? Well, first of all, we can determine which is the first player, right? We look at the board and see, okay, current pattern, it contains the first element at current pattern. What is the player that exists at that index in the board? That's what I mean, right? So to do that, we can just come over here and say first player, for example, and it's going to be equal to the board. So we're going to get the element at the board, which contains the index at pattern 0, right? We want to get the first element, right? And it's actually current pattern, sorry. So we're just going to grab the first element and see which player it is. So now we can very easily just move through the patterns, the current pattern, and just check to see if the other players in that current pattern in the board are equal to the first player, because they have to be the same, right? So we can very easily just come over here and say current pattern dot for each, because it's an array, and just grab the index to check if we need it. like this. And for each pattern, for each index in the current pattern, we just want to check if board at index is not equal actually to the first player, then we want to do something inside of here. And what we want to do is basically like this. We assume that it's going to be a winning move. We assume that we found a winning pattern. But if somewhere through the pattern array, and I'm just going to open it up again, if for example we start over here and somewhere it isn't the same player in all three of them, then we can just say that it wasn't a winning pattern. So let's create a variable over here called found winning pattern, something like this, and it's going to start as true because we assume we're going to find a winning pattern. But if we find somewhere in our loop that the board index, the element at the index in the board isn't equal to the first player, so if they aren't the same player, then we just want to say found winning pattern equals to false. And this will very easily allow us to just come here at the bottom and just ask, okay, so after the loop is done, if we still found, if found winning pattern is still true, that means we actually found a winning pattern. So we can just do something like say that we found a winner, right? We can just create a variable, a state that is going to determine that we found a winner. So that's great, right? So let's actually do that. That's actually the logic. Let's create a state here at the top called result. So const result and set result. But let's think about this. How do we want to structure this variable, right? It's going to be a state, but how do we want to structure this? Well, let's actually, just for UI purposes and like the game purposes, right, we need to actually just create an object here. The result will have two properties. One of them is the actual winner, who won the game, and the other one is just the, let's call it state. It's just like determining if we won the game or not, right? Because initially it will be, let's just call it none, and the winner will also be initially none, right? But when we win, we're going to change the winner to the actual winner and the state to something like won or game finished, something like that, right? Just to show that we actually finished the game and a person won, right? So now that we have the state, we can very easily just come here to the check if the check win function and just set result equal to an object containing a winner, and then let's just think about this, also a state, right? And the state, let's just call it 1 to determine that someone won, right? Because there might be a tie as well. Think about that. We're also going to be checking for ties. So someone won, and we just call the state 1. But then what do we put for the winner? Just think about this. The winner will be the current player, right? However, the thing with React is it's not like the states will constantly be updating, so it might be not the correct winner, and we'll actually see that. If I put over here that the winner needs to be the current player, you'll see that it won't actually show the correct player. But that's not a problem for now. We're going to fix that later on when we add more stuff to our project, right? So this is our function, right? Check win, right? It's great. But one thing we also need to take into account is that we don't want to have a row. We're checking to see if every element is the same, right? But we don't want to, initially, they are all the same because they're all literally just empty. So we need to, first of all, in the check win, we need to check to see if the first player is an empty string, right? So over here, when we determine first player, we can just very easily just come over here and say if first player is equal to an empty string, then we don't even want to move forward. We just want to return this function and like don't even look at this because it won't be a valid play, right? And now what we can do is we can actually use a built-in hook in React called the UseEffectHook, which will be fundamental to this project specifically because we need to check every time someone plays and states. If you work with them without using UseEffect, they won't be working correctly because of the like synchronous code, right? So we actually can create here at the top a UseEffectHook. We can call it UseEffectHook, which is going to be a function called every single time the board has changed, right? So this is actually how we're going to determine if someone wins. If there's a change in the board, it's going to call this UseEffect function, and whatever we put inside of here will work with the board already changed. So what exactly do we want to put here? Well, we just want to call the check win function, for now at least. So now what happens here, let's go over the logic. What happens here is we can choose a player, choose a square, beautifully over here, and that's great. But when we run this choose square function, the board has been updated, right? We set the board to have either an X or an O in the position, right? So this updated the board. So now, when we update the board, we're going to call this useEffect function, which is going to call the check win function. And the check win will check to see if any of the patterns are winning patterns. So now what we can do is we can check to see if this is working, right? I'm going to come over here, and to actually determine if this is working, what we can do is we can actually create another use effect, which is going to be called every single time the result has changed. So if someone won, obviously the result will change because we set result to be different at the bottom. So we can just call over here if the result has changed. I'm going to call this use effect. And for now, what I want to do is I just want to do something like alert the result. So let me just come over here. I'll actually say game finished, and then winning player, and I'm just gonna put the winning player to be equal to result dot winner, right? Something like this. And now let's check to see if this is working. Okay, maybe it won't. You can see it's not working right now. And the reason why it's not working is because every use effect is called initially. How do I say this? It's called initially when you render your page. So for both of this use effects that we did over here, we can make a call to ask if this is actually the first render. It's only important to use this on the use effect for the game win, like this one where we actually change the result, because we don't care that much if it checks if someone won when it's completely empty, because we made already some checks for that in our check win function. So in our use effect over here, what I can do is I can actually check, okay, if result dot state is none, then we know that it initially is as none. So if it is none, then we don't want to actually alert this. But if it isn't none, which is what I meant to do, then we want to just alert the winner. So there is a change in the result, and it isn't none, so it means something must have happened, right? So let's check this. Let's refresh our page. You can see nothing is alerted. Let's run X here, an O here, an X here, an O here, and an X here, and you can see it says gamed finish player O. So this is what I was talking about. It's not correctly showing the player. Why is this? Is because, let's think about this. We change the player immediately when we choose the square, right? So what's happening is the X was the actual player that won. However, the function which shows that checks if someone won and alerts that the game has been finished is called after we change the player. So it's changing the player before we actually determine who won, and that's like, despite it showing that the player won, like that someone won, it's not actually showing it correctly, right? And you can see that every single pattern works. You can see because of the pattern list that we actually created over here. So now that we have this logic kind of done, let's work through how do we change this error, right? How do we actually determine the player correctly, and how do we fix this? Well, what I like to do is I actually like to pick this this if player equals to X, set player 0, and set player equal to X, and put it actually, instead of doing this when we choose the square, let's just do it after we check who won, right? Because then it means that it's actually going to show the correct player, right? The problem with this is that now the person with O starts first, right? And this is just how the UseEffectHook works. It's going to be called initially, so it's going to change the player initially, right? As I mentioned before. But that isn't that much of a problem. You can see that if the person with O wins, it's going to correctly say that the player with O won. And if we try to win with X, let's try. You can see that it will say that player X has won. So it means it's working. So if we really want to make it so that it will start as an X, despite it being really weird, we just gotta set the use state to start as an O, because it's gonna be updated in the first render, as you can see right here. So you can see that now when we refresh our page, the first player is actually an X, as you can see, and it's working. We can easily just click on this, and this is a tie, right? No one won over here, and this is exactly what we're gonna be checking right now. But if someone won, like this, then it will show game finished, winning player equals to X. So how do we check if someone, like if the game is tied, right? We can use kind of similar logic to how we checked if someone won. However, it's very simple compared to this logic that we wrote over here. Actually, what we have to do is we have to create a function called, I don't know, I'm just going to call it check if tied, or if tied. And this function will actually just, every time you choose something, every time you make a move, it's just gonna loop through the whole board and try to see if, like, if it finds a square which hasn't been filled yet. If it finds, then we're gonna set a variable called found, like filled equal to false. And if it hasn't, if it doesn't find, then it means it's tied. It means that everything has been filled, and we just determine that this is actually when someone ties the game. So let's just do something similar to what we did above. Let's create a variable called filled. It's gonna start as true. We assumed it's gonna be all filled, which means there's a tie, and then we can just loop through the board and grab each square, right? And for each square, we can just check, okay, if there's a square which, if there's a square which has, which is equal to an empty string, it means it hasn't been filled yet, so it isn't a tie. So if this is true, then we can just say filled is equal to false, and we break this logic that we have here. But if it moves through this whole loop and doesn't change the value of filled to false, it means that it's actually filled. It didn't find any square that is empty, so we can just we can just say if filled, like this, is equal to true, then we can just do something like set result, and we're gonna say winner equals to no one because no one wants, well, no one won, and then we can say state for the result is equal to tie, and this is exactly, I'm actually gonna change this to 1. And now it means that we now determined if there is a tie. And we want to check this every time we make a change in the board, similar to how when we check if there's someone who won. So we can just come over here and say check if tie, and it should work like this. And now this is literally it, I think. Let's check to see if it's working. Let's just come over here. I'm going to choose square 1, square 2, square 3. Let's just move forward, and you can see it says winner player X. But now let's actually just tie the game. Let me just tie. Oh, I accidentally won. Sorry. So let me just tie the game. It's hard. Okay. Okay, this is definitely a tie, right? No. Oh, diagonal. Wait, I'll try to tie the game and I'll come back in a second. Okay guys, so I'm back and you can see that I actually tied the game. It was harder than I expected, but you can see it says game finished, winning player, no one. So that's perfect. I mean, it's working. And this is basically it for everything, right? The only last thing that I want to create, really simple, is just a restart feature, right? So after someone won, then, and I click OK here, then I want the board to be empty and I want everything to be restarted. So to do that, it's very simple actually. We can just create a function here called restart game over here. Very simple. We can just, inside of here, if we want to restart the game, then what we want to do is I just want to set board equal to its initial value. So this over here, this array with all empty values, and like this. And then I just want to also set player X to be equal to the X, right? So that's actually how we do it. And okay, it's running forever. Let me just call restart game here. In our, how can I say this? It's over here. So we alert the player who won, and then we call restart game. And now when we win the game, let me just refresh the whole page. You can see it's empty. Let me win the game over here. I'm gonna win, and I'm gonna click OK. It's gonna restart, and we can win the game again, as you can see. Oh, I just clicked here, so let me just do it again. You can see player X won diagonally, right? And actually, it's starting in the restart. It's actually starting with the O, so we can actually change this to start it with an O here, and it will update as I mentioned before, and it will actually start with an X, right? So let me refresh the page. Starts with an X, and let's win the game. Now it's gonna start with an X again, right? Yeah. So that's basically it. And and it's working, right, as you can see. So this is basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. It took me a long time to actually build everything and just make the video, so I would really appreciate if you guys could leave a comment down below. Tell me what you want to see next. Subscribe as well, because I'm posting 3 times a week, and I would really appreciate it. It would really help the channel grow. All the code for this is in the description, so if you want to check that out, just go for it. And yeah, that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.